Hello, everyone, and welcome. If you're looking for addressing cybersecurity threats and legal risks, you've come to the right place. We're pleased to have two very knowledgeable experts with us today, Kurt Roemer, the Chief Security Strategist, and Peter Lefkowitz, VP and Chief Privacy and Digital Risk Officer at Citrix. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you, Kiri.
Thanks.
In the talk today, we're going to have some slides to share, but really what we're aiming to do here is have a conversation between Kurt and Peter that's really talking about the implications that come with today's counter-security environment. So just a few quick reminders for our viewers before we get going. If you have any questions or comments for our presenters along the way, please feel free to drop those in the question box at any time. Secondly, make sure to check out the attachment section of this webinar to access a copy of the presentation, as well as all the other great resources that we've linked to. And lastly, please make sure to rate this talk afterwards. Your feedback is very, very important to us. And with those reminders out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Kurt and Peter to take us through the meat of this presentation. So Kurt, can you outline for us what we'll be hearing about today?
Sure. Thanks, Kiri, and hi, everyone. I'm Kurt Roemer. Today, we're going to discuss how to think about threats and risks that would have material impact on the business. And along with that, we're going to take a look at some of the insights from the risk and threat landscape from both cyber and legal perspectives so that you can understand all of the issues that would apply and how you can think about these in new ways, especially if you're in IT and have been thinking about IT-related risks. We're also going to spend some time talking about some of the evolving security tools and privacy tools and some of the benchmarks that you can use to take a look and see how you're doing related to industry or related to specific missions. Then we're going to talk a lot about cultural change and how driving culture is really the key to how you can improve security and privacy postures and be able to maintain that on a long-term basis for yourself and your entire ecosystem. We're going to leave you with some helpful materials to get the conversation going a little further and get you some specific things for you to get started on your journey. So let's get right into it. Taking a look at identifying threats, it's essential that you get involved with all of your stakeholders, and that includes the IT department, that includes line of business leaders, that includes representatives from major areas across the workforce. And don't forget your consultants, your vendors, and your auditors, who are also very key stakeholders. Get them involved in threat modeling. What are the threats that are most likely to be impacting the business? What are the biggest disruptors, and where should you be spending the bulk of your resources, your valuable time and money in terms of thinking about these threats, addressing them, and actively putting in place some technologies, some processes, and some practices to ensure that you're managing the threat environment. And we're looking at this not just from an IT perspective and not just from a packet perspective. We're very much looking at the impacts on people, the overall impacts on the business, and keeping in mind at all points in time that cybersecurity threats are business threats. A couple of the real keys to take a look at in here is as you're increasing your use of analytics across the organization, remember that analytics can oftentimes correlate events that humans would not necessarily see or might have a bias against. And analytics can be a great way to help prioritize what needs to be addressed from a threat perspective, of course, balancing that with the people who are responsible for those businesses so that you're making the right decisions. But increasingly, analytics are going to give us a completely different view of business and of our threat landscape. And we talked a little bit about doing threat modeling. One of the best ways to do this is by engaging in what are called tabletop exercises, where you actually sit down with the stakeholders and you go through an actual threat impacting your organization. Who's going to be responsible for communication? Who's responsible for the technical response, the legal response? Getting through everything in intricate detail so that you're prepared. And when you face new threats and new risks, there's something that you've already worked together as a team to be able to address, and especially important in today's business continuity environment. You know, Peter, how should people best get prepared for business continuity events these days?
Well, Kurt, really, you've given such a good summary I'll just give one thought here, which is that while there are business continuity events that we all need to be focused on, really everyone needs to start from what company are they in? What is your threat environment? Are you based in a climate like Florida or a climate like Michigan? Are you in technology, in critical infrastructure, in financial services, in food service? What are the goals of your company? And critically, what is the culture of your company? All of these things are going to influence what is most important to you in thinking about business continuity. And I think the slide that comes up next really demonstrates what these base items are, but they're all going to be need to be flexible in light of those factors. So, Kurt, do you want to talk a bit about these events?
Sure, absolutely. And, in the interest of the time that we have, I'm not going to be able to cover all of these. If you've got something specific that you're interested in going into in a little more depth, either contact us afterwards or please ask a question at the end in the Q&A. One of the big things that we need to think about in terms of the risk and threat landscape as this expands outside of IT is that it's not just the traditional CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, availability, that many of us security professionals have been raised on. Today, increasingly with Internet of Things, IoT, with augmented reality, with virtual reality, and with other ways that we're immersing into our physical environments, we have to add safety as a core factor. So if your risk and threat landscape and your policies that support it don't include safety, go back and review it, get your stakeholders involved, and start to understand where safety could be a huge disruptor to the business and what to do about that. Disruption is a very key theme throughout all of this, and it's definitely one to keep in mind. And as you see, many of the areas on the slide, they do very much involve disruptors. Another big piece on here to consider is looking at KPIs, and whether you call them KPIs, key performance indicators, or OKRs, which is objectives and key results, make sure that you're measuring your risk and threat landscape, your security, your privacy. You've got something empirical that you can go back to and be able to compare and see how you're evolving over time to meet new risks and threats, new regulatory frameworks, et cetera. One big secret to that is to express your configuration as code so that you can go through and audit the code. You can have workflow that's engaged as you're going through the code and it crosses different risk or threat landscape thresholds where you need to get different people involved. The more that you can do config as code, the more you're going to be able to manage this and measure it moving forward. And when you also take a look at the risk and threat landscape, data sovereignty and being able to keep data within region and data at rest, not having it move around, sometimes those seem like very antiquated concepts, don't they, Peter? How does that affect privacy these days?
Well, they do, but interestingly, as data takes on more value, there are a number of risks associated with both the value of data, because data becomes more valuable to a bad actor, but also from the legal landscape, thinking about where can you hold data, where can you move data? Are there preconditions that you need to meet from a legal or regulatory basis? Are there certain types of data that can and can't move? We've started to see across major jurisdictions around the world restrictions on the movement of any personal information, as in Europe, the restrictions on movement of the first copy of data, as in Russia, restrictions on certain types of data, critical infrastructure, commercial banking, and health data in China, proposals to limit movement of artificial intelligence from the United States. And so depending upon the industry you're in, depending upon the type of data that you hold and how you use it, I think that really for the first time, we all need to add into that risk and threat landscape the importance of and the dangers of not thinking through the types of data that you have and how they're being used. But pulling the lens back, this next slide really talks about sort of how you can break down and think about risk, right? There are financial, operational, compliance, reputational, and strategic risks. I think that you can drill down on each of these. It's very helpful to drill down in each of these. So for financial risks, what are the core financial risks under SOX or any other framework that your organization has? How does that play out when it comes to data, when it comes to management of systems, when it comes to management of people? Obviously, operational risks, we all think in those terms. We've talked a bit about compliance risks. Reputation risk looms large. If you handle an incident or an issue or a risk poorly, there will surely be somebody there to report on it. And then all of this really funnels into strategic risks, because strategic risk, brand risk, is the combination of all of the items above. And really, I would say, it sounds trite, but I would say every risk can be a risk or can be an opportunity. If you handle risks well, you have an opportunity to differentiate yourself. Let me ask you, Kurt, do you have any thoughts on these risks, or in particular on security risk?
Yeah, I would really remind everybody that when you take a look at cybersecurity risks, they are also business risks. And so oftentimes people think about the cyber aspects just in their own context. And you might have something that's a critical vulnerability that you see as becoming a very critical threat targeted against your organization. Don't just put that on a report and sit back and say you did your job. Shout that from the rooftops. We've got some major vulnerabilities and issues that are being addressed these days that affect the business, and we need to make sure that the IT organization has the ability to have that really loud voice when they need it. And really, that also moves on to having the right security policies and measures in place. And one of the things that we want to encourage everybody to evolve to is making sure that your policies specify that you're continuously situationally aware and contextually risk appropriate. So you know all the different situations that people are working in throughout the day, all the different areas they're working from, different devices, different sensitivities of applications, and different regulatory frameworks, as Peter had talked about. And you're automatically adjusting their exposure to that risk and their ability to manage that risk based on contexts, based on what I like to call the 5 W's of context, which is who, what, when, where, and why. So you're taking every access decision, every lifecycle usage decision of data, and every transaction, and applying some combination of those 5 W's to make sure that you are continuously situationally aware and contextually risk appropriate. Notice how this is so much more evolved than just assessing security at login. And along with that, a lot of organizations are moving to a zero trust framework or contemplating that. And especially as you move beyond enterprise security, and in many ways, a lot of people are moving people home and working from offsite these days as part of their workforce and business continuity plans. Zero trust is essential because once you've removed the environment of enterprise trust, you have to go through and assume that there is no trust and build on this foundation of zero trust by verifying trust elements. Once again, going back to those 5 W's of context, the who, what, when, where, and why, looking at devices and people and situations and applications and roles and projects that they're working on, and making sure that their environment is very specifically risk appropriate to that situation. That's what zero trust is to me, and it's definitely something to have a much wider conversation on. Another big aspect on here is the shared responsibility model. In the past, many saw IT as the shepherd and the owner for cybersecurity. And today it's pretty widely understood that all of us have security responsibilities, not only just for the enterprise, but also personally as well. And Peter will probably get into a little bit of the shared privacy model too later. But shared responsibility means that you understand what your cloud provider is going to be bringing to the table, what regulatory frameworks are there. You know who's responsible for implementing the technologies, maintaining them, auditing them, and you actually have a dashboard where you can go in and ensure that that shared responsibility model is adding up and that you see people have been able to fulfill their obligations all the way across the model. I mean, that's the ultimate, and the business absolutely needs that these days. Once again, we're factoring in those aspects of confidentiality, integrity, availability, and safety, and those should be very clear within that shared responsibility model. Now, one other thing that I wanted to call out on here is a very near-term concern. As more and more organizations are moving to the cloud, as more applications are moving to browser-based applications, either on your laptops or desktops or on mobile devices, the browser has become more critical than ever to maintaining security. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations and individuals are still stuck in that model where they have one browser that rules them all. And that one browser is configured to do everything from just getting in and checking the weather or news, to maybe going on to Facebook, to maybe even managing some of the most sensitive information in the organization, or administering and having privileged access to your cloud environment and making material changes to the infrastructure of the business. A lot of organizations have not thought about what the browser strategy needs to be these days and how you'd update your security measures and policies to support it. It's a much bigger conversation, but let me give you a little intro to that. When you publish any type of application these days or deploy any resource or service, you have one of four ways to do that. You can either go direct, giving people direct unfettered access to the resource, which of course has some very limited abilities for security to intervene. You can go through proxies, which can be network proxies, application-based proxies embedded in the browser. They can be CASBs, Cloud Access Security Brokers, and other API-based proxies. But basically, proxies are doing content rewrites, and they're doing inspections, and they're making decisions based on the content to either block or allow or present it in a little different manner. The third way is virtualization, where you're not actually sending the data down to the endpoint. You're just sending a representative of the data, and you're sending the pixels. And also with virtualization, you've got control over clipboard behavior, whether you can copy or paste in or out. You've got the ability to go through and control peripherals, whether the webcam's on or off. All of these are very critical to your browser. And then the last is containerized. And you might think, how does containerized go through and impact the browser strategy? Well, browsers can run in container frameworks, either locally on the machine, run out in the cloud as a one-time use hosted cloud browser, or in many other ways, and can even be complemented with HVI or hypervisor introspection. So if you haven't thought about those four ways of deploying resources, direct, proxied, virtualized, and containerized in the context of browsers, it's time to update that browser strategy. And that's a very key aspect of current security policy. All right, so I think that covers a lot of it from the cyber side. Peter, why don't you talk a little bit more about how everybody should be thinking about privacy and regulatory frameworks moving forward?
Absolutely, thank you, Kurt. So I'm going to continue on in the same vein. And it sounds odd to do that with privacy. We've always thought of privacy as what data are you collecting and do you have consent to use it? What's happened in the last 5 years, and I really think it's a product of realization that personal information is nothing more than information that needs to be managed that has to do with people. There is personal information, non-personal information, every database and every system, in every internet-connected device information flow. And so what's happened in the last 5 years or so with the privacy community is we've moved from a rule-based, collection-based mechanism to an accountability-based framework. So the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, Articles 5 and then 25 through 39. We see it in Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore, other jurisdictions around the world, and now starting in the US under the California Consumer Privacy Act. We're moving to a framework now that doesn't just ask, how are you collecting data, but it asks, how do you protect it? What do you collect? How long do you keep it? With whom do you share it? What's your primary use? What are the other uses to which you put it? Critically, how do you minimize it? What do you hold on to for a period of time? Is it for the intended use or for some other? Do you minimize the amount that you keep? And then do you pseudonymize it or anonymize it? And this is now being built not just into the legal frameworks, but into the standards that sit behind it. And so NIST has had the cybersecurity framework. NIST has just released version 1 of the privacy framework, which follows the same exact notion of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover that's under the cybersecurity framework. ISO has done similarly. We've long lived with the ISO 27000 framework, 27001, 27002, and now for cloud 27018. Now ISO has 27701, which is a privacy management framework. And so for those of you who have always lived in the world of cybersecurity, in the world of risk management around data, there is a wonderful parallel that can be applied to privacy and privacy risk management across systems, services, devices, and it allows you to do the kind of measurement that Kurt was talking about. And I think that that requires a cultural change in the way that privacy officers act. It requires a cultural change in the way that privacy officers interact with security and IT groups and others in the company. But I also think that it requires a cultural change in the way that organizations think about data and think about the way that they manage data. So, Kurt, why don't you talk a bit about cultural change, which I think is going to be so important to the way in coming years that we think about data and the way that we manage it.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Culture is extremely important, and it's great to see NIST call that out in their cybersecurity framework. We need to make sure that we're organizing, guiding, and automating work and using that to help drive the culture. In the past, when we had a lot of discrete applications or desktops that were published that had certain apps on it and certain access to data, it was hard to think about your IT systems being part of your culture and being part of cultural change. But today, as organizations are increasingly deploying workspaces and going through and making sure that they've got not just the access to the applications in there, but really thinking about your outcomes and your work products and helping to coach people to do the right things in the right ways, you can start to think a lot more about how your IT systems will drive positive cultural change. A big part of this is looking at your culture as something that exists across the organization, but can also be expressed as code. We talked a little bit about configuration as code before. What about expressing your culture as code? Have you thought about that? Expressing your culture as code gives you the opportunity to measure it, gives you the opportunity to coach people, and gives you the opportunity to be able to see exactly where the business is in terms of maturity, and lets you fix things where they need to be fixed and basically move at the speed of business. So, Peter, as we're talking about culture and we're talking about measurement, that brings up some privacy issues, doesn't it?
You know, it does. And Kurt, I thought we'd use the example of monitoring because monitoring is such an important area in order to protect security. It's such an important area to protect security of systems that hold private information. You know, they say you can't have privacy without security. But there's also a balance, which is you can certainly have security without privacy. And so we can walk through, and I think everybody that's watching can walk through all of the elements that you need to think about. What is it that you want to measure? You want to measure the number of people on your website. You want to measure the number of people that are coming into your building. You want to collect information through cookies. Then what do you need to measure, right? What do you need to monitor? Well, certainly you need to measure and monitor access and authentication. Are the right people coming in? Do they have the right credentials? Are the people that are coming in with the right credentials the people that you think they are? Are they coming in from the places that you intend them to be? And so you can get deeper and deeper and deeper into measuring that. But I would say that's the top down. I would say there's also the bottom up, which is doing a privacy impact assessment. Who is it and is it that you are measuring and monitoring? Are you doing it in a risk appropriate way? So for example, if you're at the entrance of a building and you want to measure how many people are coming into a building, you could do a camera looking straight down. You can do a camera that looks at everything, but then only records the number of heads that go past the camera. If you want to measure who's coming into an office, you can point the camera at the door and only at the door. It shouldn't be at the washroom. It shouldn't be pointed at individuals' desks. And then you can ask yourself questions like, how long do you retain the tape? Who has access to the tape? How securely is the tape kept? And do you have the ability through an approval process to only allow certain people to see it? I would say the same is true online. If you're measuring and monitoring access, you certainly need to know, do you have one-factor or two-factor authentication? How long are you keeping those logs? You probably don't need keystroke logging for most purposes. And so it is striking that right balance from a privacy perspective, from a security perspective, and from a brand and trust perspective. Kurt, do you have any other thoughts on monitoring?
Yeah, I'd say one thing that's evolving here is the ability to use monitoring to help the employee experience. So you might have an employee who is sending out a particular spreadsheet and they don't notice that it has privacy implications, that there's PII in there, maybe US Social Security numbers. Today, maybe your DLP system would catch that, or IT would stop behind your desk and say, hey, what's going on? Something just set off an alarm. What if instead your workspace came back and said, hey, I notice you're sending this out and it's unencrypted. Did you know that there's Social Security numbers in here? And if not, would you like me to delete that column, redact it, tokenize it, whatever, encrypt this just for the recipient? Or was this simply a mistake and we should just not do this right now? Wouldn't it be great if you had that guardian angel that was part of your workspace? And increasingly with digital assistant technologies, I think we're going to see that.
So Kurt, would you like to wrap us up?
Sounds good. Couple things from a key takeaway perspective. I talked about policies before that are continuously situationally aware, contextually risk appropriate. If you're not doing that, move towards that as quickly as possible, because that's really how we're going to be guiding work. As you can see, today's cybersecurity, legal, and privacy frameworks are extremely complicated, and they're only getting more so. Let's build this in. Let's automate this for people as much as possible. And it's also about increasing resilience and making sure that we're helping people to be resilient to things that would disrupt them in a bad way. Also, this is bidirectional. It's not just privacy for the organization and their privacy policies and their security policies. It's how can all of us as employees also benefit and have these bidirectional policies. And then, of course, we have to support the business. And as we do that, there are really three primary levers: productivity, security, and cost. In everything you do, you're balancing those. And of course, supporting legal compliance, as Peter would like to say. But security, productivity, and cost are things that you need to factor into each and every decision. And we need to increasingly build the capability into our workspaces so that line of business leaders can make these decisions to support their P&Ls as well as IT. And that's really where we're going to. One other key takeaway we have, though, is a very, very key resource for you. And I'll let Peter talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So Kurt, as you noted, these are complex topics, and every company, every organization has its own way of handling it. One thing that we found quite useful, and I know a number of other companies have found quite useful, is to create a portal. We call it the Citrix Trust Center, but other organizations have their own names for it, where you put up what you do. We put up our privacy policies. We put up documentation about the logs that are collected through our services, who our subcontractors are, the various agreements that we use upstream and downstream. And it provides an opportunity before customers buy to understand what we do and how we do it. And I think we're not unique in doing it these days. In a world of more complex risk and therefore more complex processing control, we try to get ahead of it. I think a number of other companies try to get out ahead of it and say, these are the certifications we have, these are the policies we have, and this is the control base that we have. So, Kyrie, why don't I hand it back to you, and we can certainly take some questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you guys. This is really a great discussion, and I think you've given us a lot of things to be thinking about. So definitely appreciate your time today sharing your expertise with us. So my colleague Jane and I have been monitoring the questions that have been coming in throughout the presentation today, and I think we have a little bit of time left to answer a few of those. So one of the questions asked was around public key infrastructure and how that fits into the compliance and strategic risk models.
Yeah, when you take a look at public key infrastructure and key management in general, it's been a bit of a challenge in the past, and there hasn't been a really good way to manage that outside of IT and especially across organizations. I think what we're seeing these days with more identity and personas moving to the cloud, we're going to have a better framework in place to do that. Take a look at what the big cloud providers are making available from DRM perspective, digital rights management, IRM, information rights management, how I can send a document to both Kyrie and Peter and make sure that it's encrypted so that just us as a team are able to work on that document with very sensitive information. And even if somebody outside of us were to get a copy of it, they would not be able to read that document because they do not have the keys to unlock it. That's a very important concept, but even more importantly, how can we make sure that it's easy for the three of us to work within that infrastructure? You know, if your workspace knows that we are collaborating as a team and we are working on Secret Project X and it's helping to manage that for us, we're moving much, much closer to the promises of PKI being able to benefit everyone. So great question.
Awesome. Thanks, Kurt. Appreciate your response. All right, let's see. We've had a couple other questions come through. One was around the culture as code. Kurt, you mentioned that a few slides back. They're asking, how can you create a configuration file for culture? And can you provide some more examples of what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. Culture as code is something very directional. It's not something that probably you can do today, but it's something you can start moving towards. Identify those key aspects of your corporate culture and determine how you can measure them, how you can measure them at an organizational level, at a business unit level, at an individual level, and start to put together those KPIs or OKRs to be able to measure those and then express those as code so that you can see how you're guiding the culture over time. I also talked about the digital assistant and being able to have a virtual coach to guide you, that will also help from a cultural perspective to highlight where some of those cultural issues come up and how they're being handled and where you might need additional training, additional intervention, or may need somebody to step in and say, hey, we're evolving the culture in this way. This department needs to get on board with that. Peter, any other thoughts?
I think this is an area that we've been working on for quite a while. I think one of the things that's nice now is that when we look at our employee base, when we look at how we all interact, when we provide services online, we actually are better able to measure those now. And it really is critical. It is critical that we measure, and we're always improving on our ability to build a security framework and a security culture into what we do. It's certainly something that we do internally. We are always looking at how we're performing. We're always looking at our employees' response to the initiatives we're coming out with.
Great. Thank you. All right. So, Kurt, you had talked a little bit about the shared responsibility model. You had also mentioned a shared privacy model. And Peter, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and tell us a little bit more of some good examples around that.
Well, this is a model that Americans are getting used to, but that the Europeans have long thought about, right? This concept of controllers and processors and co-controllers. The fact is that information doesn't go into a single database and then live in a vacuum, right? In the technology world, there's the infrastructure layer, there's the platform layer, there are applications, there are customers, there are sub-processors, there are analytics providers. In the healthcare world, we go to a doctor who sends us to a radiology department. We go to get our drugs. The drugs have sit at a pharmacy that in turn depends upon the provider of the drugs. There are entities that sit in the middle that measure, is Peter the person who went to the hospital, who went to the doctor, who ordered the drugs, who had the test. So we live in a very complex world that we historically have thought of as a series of single actors that we now are increasingly realizing under privacy models, right? Things like the NIST and ISO frameworks, we're now realizing that there's no such thing as a single entity that any of one of us engages with. And what we have to build into the way that we're managing privacy as an accountability framework is that it's not just the consumer coming to the one entity, the entity interacting with that consumer and just one-to-one, but it's really now one-to-many. And we all have a role to play in making sure that we maintain consistent controls.
Yeah, I would say also from a shared responsibility model perspective, get all your stakeholders together, do that threat modeling, and don't just think about shared responsibility as operations as normal. Think about when things go horribly wrong and how shared responsibility changes. It's more important than ever.
Absolutely. Very spot on. Thank you. All right, I think we have time for just a couple more questions. So Kurt, this one is for you. You talked about the various different browser strategies, the direct, the proxy, containerization, virtualization. Is there one that you think is superior to the others or is preferred compared to the other three?
No. And that's really the short answer. It's something that has to be very dynamically chosen based on your situation. You know, maybe you're watching a YouTube video that requires hardware acceleration. That's probably best to run on your local endpoint in some way, shape, or form. If it's got no security implications to it or no privacy implications, maybe it can run in a native browser, and that's a great risk environment. But if it does have security and privacy implications, what if it's automatically curtained and walled off from all the other applications and services running on your endpoint. Maybe it's running in a container framework. And in that way, you can run something sensitive, but not have any outside applications interfere with it. You may also have a situation where you've got employees at work who need to go through and monitor social media. Maybe they're going out on Facebook. Well, as they go out on Facebook, there are lots of other plugins, and I hear that there's games like Candy Crush and Farmville and stuff like that that I've never played, but heard about those. What if you could give somebody access to Facebook, but not allow them to play the games while they're at work? And more importantly, what if you could give them access to their personal Facebook and never have it hit their endpoint, your networks, your logs? It's something you don't have to worry about from a legal and privacy perspective. Maybe that's best to run as a one-time use hosted browser out in the cloud. So there's lots of aspects to this. Happy to have that enterprise browser conversation. And if you're interested, please set up some time to dive into that in detail.
Awesome. Thank you, Kurt. All right, last question for this session. So talking about revisiting security strategy, things change so quickly, as you both have noted at various points. How often should we be looking at our strategy and updating this? Is this something that should happen once a quarter? Is annual enough? Should we be doing it even more frequently than once a quarter? What do you suggest?
Yeah, I think Peter likes to talk a lot about the basics, and I love the NIST cybersecurity framework for that, because it does have some very simple measures you can discuss with the rest of the organization. Anytime your threat landscape changes, anytime there's significant potential disruption to the business, you're going into any new business initiatives, you need to revisit your cybersecurity strategy. It should be very fluid. And there should be any number of the stakeholders, particularly from the legal and privacy perspective, that can bring up, hey, it's a time to make some changes here, and here's their projected implications. Peter?
I'd also say, Kurt, that your framework and your strategy has to be flexible enough, has to be high enough off the ground that you have room to adapt. So for example, our incident response policy has a series of runbooks. The policy may change once a year. The runbooks are continually evolving. I would think of all of cybersecurity approach and all of your data approach along the same lines. You have overall tenets, you have overall things that, parts of the tree that you can hang leaves off of, and those leaves have to have an opportunity to grow and evolve over time.
Great. Thank you both for your perspective on that. I appreciate it. And thank you. And that really wraps up the time that we have today. So I really hope that everyone on this call was able to take away some valuable insights on the security and legal considerations for architecting your workspace. We've really enjoyed having the opportunity to be here with you all today. And thank you all for dedicating your time and attention to this talk. So we hope to see you again next time. And until then, have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you all.